Welcome to Machine Minds, where technology and humanity meet. I'm your host, Greg Terrusian, founder of Samson Rose, a recruiting and search business focused on the robotics and AI industries. The Machine Minds show is where we dive deep into the intricate world of robotics and artificial intelligence. As a staffing industry leader with a passion for the frontiers of technology, I'm pleased to be bringing you intimate conversations with the founders, investors, and trailblazers who are at the heart of the AI and robotics revolution. In each episode, we dig into their journeys, the applications of the products they're working on, and the breakthroughs that are shaping our future. Join us as we explore how these machine minds are transforming the way we live, work, and understand our world. Whether you're an entrepreneur, a tech enthusiast, or just curious about this amazing field, you'll learn something new with each episode. Let's delve into the extraordinary. Let's delve into Machine Minds. Hello and welcome to Machine Minds. I'm your host, Greg Terrusian, founder of Samson Rose, a robotics and AI-focused search firm. And on today's episode, we're joined by Justin Selfridge, CEO of Devorto Corporation. Devorto is developing the Tern UAV. Thanks for being here, Justin.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited. Thanks again.
Yeah, me too. Let's jump into it. So this episode's a little bit different. As we will talk about offline, we're usually interviewing purely robotics and AI industry focused people, but your product, Devorto, what you're developing, I believe, and like I said, we talk about offline, has an impact across the board. So I really want to dive into this. But first, let's talk about your background, your career journey, and what kind of led you to starting Devorto.
Yeah, absolutely. And just for a little bit of a teaser context, just so everyone on the podcast is aware, kind of what we're building up to, Devorto is building an aircraft that never has to land. So essentially, it's a solar-powered aircraft that collects enough energy during the day to where it can run on batteries at night. And the idea is that we can repeat that cycle indefinitely, right? We're not concerned about how much fuel we have to carry. We don't have to land because the tank is getting dry. The goal is to just be able to have a black box sensor package just live in the stratosphere indefinitely. And so the goal with that is to be able to provide better capabilities in satellites, but for the cost and logistics of a drone. So we'll dive into like the specifics of the vehicle and how different it is and how wild and crazy it is. But yeah,
that's
just
a great hook.
Yeah,
great
absolutely.
Hook.
I mean, let's at least give a little context.
Yeah.
Where are we leading with this?
Yeah.
But yeah, myself, a little background on myself. My name is Dr. Justin Selfridge. I used to work at NASA Langley for 7 years doing adaptive controls for experimental aircraft. So the way I like to say it is anytime that NASA came up with some wild and crazy new aircraft that they wanted to build a prototype for and they weren't quite sure how it was going to fly, it was basically my department's job to figure out what's the controls. How are we going to get this thing operational? How can we collect some data to actually study it? And then that kind of led into a little project of my own where I was looking at solar-powered persistent flight aircraft. And then at that point, I just decided this is an interesting enough vehicle that I want to do this for my dissertation. And that was kind of my origin story.
Very cool. That's great. And working at NASA for so long, you must have seen some really interesting things that you probably can't share all of it.
blows your hair back as to like the kind of ideas that come out, it's like, and just the really good science too. I think for a while there, I think people were kind of just associating NASA purely with like the space shuttle, and it kind of got into that groove of, oh, we're just doing space taxi, but being in it, that's not NASA's mission. NASA's mission is good science. So I think that pulling away from the space shuttle and kind of giving that role to SpaceX was probably the best thing they could do to kind of refocus and invigorate their emphasis on science. Unfortunately, their focus isn't on commercialization.
Yeah.
So when I finished the dissertation and the Air Force was like, hey, we'll give you a phase 1 grant to prototype it. It was kind of a conflicting point in the sense that, wow, I'd worked really hard to get here. But I also recognize that this vehicle is not going to be commercialized by NASA.
Right.
If this vehicle is going to become more than just a dissertation paper study, I'm going to have to start my own company and just literally forge ahead with this. So took the Air Force grant and been doing this full time ever since.
That's great. Well, that gives us more context there to the founding of Devorto for sure. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about your mission and vision, which you kind of teased a little bit early on in this. So can you talk more about that and
and then tie that back to the inspiration to starting the company.
Yeah, absolutely. So I like to say that at the end of the day, I like the aircraft design itself, but it's really the applications and the use cases that are really, really important. And the idea of having a persistent flight aircraft is exciting, but again, it's what it delivers, which is really, really important. And the way I like to sum it up is it's just prohibitively expensive to close the gap on the digital divide. So telecom companies have no problem putting up cell towers or laying down hard fiber in urban areas because there's a very high densely populated area. It makes sense to amortize that cost over a lot of potential users. But when you look at cell phone towers only covering about 3 miles of range and laying down fiber costs over $60,000 per mile, if we're talking about really rural areas of, say, America, where 20% households live, it's just prohibitively expensive to put that infrastructure in place. And then if you were to take one step even further at things like underdeveloped countries, so think about Africa. Google and Facebook are really interested in gaining a presence in Africa because they just want to grow the entire internet. So if they can grow the internet, then they grow the amount of advertising they can do. But those kind of underdeveloped countries just don't have the resources to even begin thinking about that type of infrastructure. So really, when we're talking about a high altitude platform station or HAPS or a solar powered aircraft, it's not just for the sake of getting an aircraft that can just stay up. I mean, there really is a very compelling business and market opportunity to be able to connect people and close this gap.
It's awesome. Love that. And let's talk a bit about the development of Tern UAV and what that acronym stands for.
Yep, absolutely. So I'll give a little bit of a background context first. Because the vehicle is so different, it's kind of important to know like where it came from and why it looks the way it does.
Yeah.
So just for a little background context, pursuing solar powered persistent flight isn't really anything new. DARPA has spent over $750 million looking at both fixed wing and airship designs, but everything was canceled from a lack of technical feasibility. Tier one aerospace companies really looked at a lot of different exotic designs, but didn't manage to commercialize anything. And then technology companies were actually acquiring pre-revenue companies, but walked away from their initial investments just because nothing really panned out from a capability standpoint. So the real question is, why is it so difficult to get to the stratosphere? And the answer is, if you think about what goes into an aerodynamically efficient aircraft, okay, imagine like a glider, right? Characterized by its long, skinny wings. We call that a high aspect ratio. You have to have those long, skinny wings if you're going to get your drag down. So what all these groups were doing was just saying, okay, well, let's just take that design and keep going further and further and further and further. But when you do that, you end up all this extra flexibility, and you have to add extra material to strengthen it. And even fully optimized designs just can't do the job with existing solar and battery technology. So we're kind of like hitting a plateau with what we can do with a traditional fixed wing design. So for my dissertation, I was working on a different rotorcraft type project. And the question that I asked for my dissertation was, could we borrow the physics of a helicopter? Okay, so they have long, skinny rotors, which actually droop under their own weight, right, and only become rigid once you start spinning it. Now, because the helicopter weighs so much and those rotors have to spin so fast, they have absolutely terrible aerodynamics. So that's where the analogy ends. But just for a second, think about a rock spinning on a string, right? Pulling that line tight. What if we could use that physics to solve the aerodynamic structural problem, which is plaguing these fixed wing aircraft? So basically, the design for the tethered unirotor network, Tern, it's not a change of fixed wing. It's not an adaptation of helicopters, an entirely new aerial structure, where instead of one aircraft that can't do the job on its own, we have four. And they're all tethered together in a hub and spoke arrangement, spinning like a helicopter, but for the sole purpose of pulling each wing taut. As soon as we put those wings under tension, then it radically changes the design space. So we're able to cut the battery mass, we're able to cut the structural mass in half, double the amount of batteries, maximize the aspect ratio, kind of maximize the L over D ratio. And what you end up with is something that still has VTOL, vertical takeoff and hover like a helicopter, but because we're changing the structural paradigm, it actually runs on 10 times less power. So now that puts
Wow.
solar-powered persistent flight within reach and offers vastly increased flight endurances for smaller scale systems as well. So rather than waiting for solar or battery to just catch up with an aircraft that we already have, the question I asked is, can we just come up with a better aircraft? And so that's where Tern comes in.
That's really cool. That's usually the question that sets it off, isn't it?
Yeah.
So what kind of space, this is just from my own curiosity. Oh, and before I forget, I encourage people to go to your website, and we'll leave this at the end anyway, but you've got an explainer video on there, an animated one,
Absolutely.
which is pretty cool to check out how this looks. But
Mhm.
what kind of space do you need for takeoff then?
So
Takeoff and landing?
Yeah, so the nice thing is it is tethered, and most people, I want to draw an immediate distinction. When I say tethered, I mean it's tethered only to itself. It is a free-flying vehicle. It could take off in New York and fly all the way over to Los Angeles, right? The tethers are just a way to induce system rotation as a design element. That being said, you would think, okay, tethers are going to make the footprint pretty large. So it actually starts fully retracted, where we have a nice central hub, and each of the rotor wings are kind of just tucked in nice and tight. The whole thing spools up on the tarmac, and then once it gets above local obstructions, okay, it takes more power to do that, yes, because it's now the aerodynamics are closer to that of a helicopter. But all you have to do is get above trees, buildings, and any sort of local obstructions, and then you start letting the tethers out. Once the tethers are let out and each of those rotor wings can just operate in clean, undisturbed, turbulent-free air, that's when you start kicking in your aerodynamic efficiency. And now, because it's a free-flying vehicle, you can get up however high you need, and you can get from point A to point B.
Very cool. So would, I guess not commute, but travel actually be a real application for this? I know you mentioned like New York to LA and stuff like that, or would it be more for
No,
just hovering above?
I don't see this as the main value proposition for a solar powered persistent flight capability is not really trying to get people or cargo from point A to point B. Because as soon as you're taking off and landing, you kind of lose all of the benefits. We just want to be able to get something there and stay there. The reason that I like talking about, say, New York to Los Angeles is because the real value proposition of this aircraft is not specifically the aircraft itself, but on telecom communications, kind of that connectivity, kind of providing the backbone for the next wireless telecom industry. So I don't really look at this as having one single vehicle in operation. I look at it as a mesh network, and being able to move that network and that around to be able to service different regions, or if there's different bandwidth requirements that peak and fall at different parts of the day, being able to move them around appropriately to be able to service whoever needs that service at that time. That's kind of where I draw the analogy of New York to Los Angeles. Like, if we need to take off and then kind of have things just distribute around, then we can have them service areas they need and then bring them back for payload upgrades. So that's kind of one of the main limitations with satellites is, aside from being really expensive and needing a rocket launch, which doesn't always work with the weather on that day, once you get a satellite into orbit, it just needs to stay in that orbit, right? So do not collect $200. You're on that orbit. And so in the movies, when people say, oh, hey, we have 90 seconds until we lose visual, like, that's a real thing. When satellites move out of sight, you're gone, you're done. So things like Starlink, the reason they need 42,000 satellites to be able to try to deliver this capability is because 70% of the planet is covered in oceans. So they need an astronomically large number of assets to be able to provide that kind of homogeneous, uniform coverage, right? Even though 7 out of 10 of their assets are just over an ocean, not really doing anything. So one of the benefits of being able to do this with a solar-powered aircraft is, because we can move from point A to point B, and once we get there, we can stay put. We can just put the aircraft wherever they're needed, right? We don't need to deploy 70% of our assets in useless locations. We can actually direct them to where they need to go. And so I really like the idea of, kind of leaning into, for the topic of kind of AI and robotics. On the one hand, I look at this type of vehicle and this type of connectivity as being able to let AI, work with mobile applications. But I also like the idea of AI as being kind of the main driver to figure out, how do we manipulate this network
Yeah,
to really optimize its efficiency.
for sure. Yeah, I mean, you can see straight away, or at least I can, like the benefits of technology like this helping in like um, rural or off the beaten path
Hmm.
projects, whether it's construction, oil and gas,
Oh,
energy,
absolutely.
new data center creation. Um, and I mean, obviously, with everything going on in the world right now, connectivity in certain regions has become like a focal point, right? For whether it's media coverage or even people connecting to loved ones and things
Hmm.
like that, and from the defense sector. Could this be used for like observation as well? Like
Yeah,
borders and
absolutely. I like to say that if you can just have a sensor that is just, if you relax the constraint of flight endurance, so of
Mhm.
course we're looking at the solar power persistent flight, but we've also had some interest from different groups, not on solar powered, but just on a smaller scale drone that flies 20 times longer than multi-rotor. Just the idea of being able to get a camera payload and kind of provide that persistent stare has a number of different use cases. So right now, we've done a lot of funding through NASA and the United States Air Force, and we actually have a customer memorandum from the Washington Air National Guard specifically for aerial wildfire monitoring. So right now, it costs taxpayers about $2,000 or $3,000 an hour to have three people hop into a plane and fly over wildfire. Just because that intelligence, that eyes, that aerial view is
Mhm.
so important to people, the ground personnel down below. But it's a dangerous environment, and it's people in an aircraft, like a
Right.
30 passenger aircraft that's been retrofitted. So when we were talking about some of the endurances that we would be able to provide, not their initial gut response was excellent. That's going to take three people out of harm's way and significantly reduce our costs. That's kind of
Yeah.
like the tip of the iceberg. But when we dug a little deeper, actually, two other things came out of it. One is the advanced knowledge of where the wildfire is. So if we actually have more of a persistent capability, then we can have advanced detection. Right now, they're just basically responding to a problem that they've already found about kind of late in the game.
Yeah. Very
To kind of put it
reactive.
in perspective, the numbers that were quoted to me was the first 6 hours of a wildfire largely determines whether they put it out in 6 days or 6 weeks. And so
Wow.
everybody's kind of become seeing the news about, California just seems like it's being engulfed with flames, like,
Hmm.
like billions of dollars of property damage. But if it's just literally, you can get to it when it's one little tiny fire versus, oh, a couple hours has passed and now we have this huge problem on our hands. That
Yeah.
first critical time is absolutely imperative.
Yeah.
And then the second thing that came out was we did a customer discovery with Cal Fire. And I figured, oh, it'll be the exact same use case. What else are we going to learn here? But something else new actually came of it, which was, would you be able to put an LTE payload on this? And I said, well, yeah, actually communications, that's kind of our like main thing. We're like really focused on that. But why would you care about that for, aerial wildfire monitoring? And the response was, well, most of these wildfires are in such rural areas that they have notoriously terrible cell phone service. If
Hmm.
we have an asset in position that's already looking at the fire, we'd like to be able to send out text message alerts.
Yeah.
Kind of
That's
get
what I was
away.
gonna
Like
say.
this is really
Yeah.
close to you. You need to get out of Dodge like
Yeah.
imminently.
Yeah.
So I thought that was
I'm
really interesting.
yeah, I'm in California in the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, seeing how bad these fires are getting and where they're actually starting.
Hmm.
That's exactly what I was thinking. If they're, because some of them do really start in the middle of nowhere
Yeah.
sometimes, or, from a very random cause, or sometimes it's just people not being responsible, right? But again, it's out in the middle of
Yep.
nowhere and they spread so quickly.
Yes.
Um, but also, you can't tell anyone about it. If
Correct.
you're the person there, if it's your campfire or whatever it is that was happening, you can't tell
Absolutely. It's
anyone.
like, oh
Yeah.
man, do I really want to be held responsible for this? Which actually, that's another funny anecdotal point is some of our advisors are in California, and
Hmm.
one is so adamant about like getting rallying behind this for aerial wildfire monitoring, not just like preventing the property damage, but his response is, I want to know who did it. So
Find me
make
someone
sure
to
you have a
blame.
camera loitering around so we can backtrack and figure out who
Yeah.
did this thing in the first place.
That's great. Yeah. I think that I was having this conversation this week actually with another podcast guest, but about like the
Yes.
insurances for wildfires and stuff. And in
Hmm.
California, so many insurance providers are leaving the state because of wildfires and things
Yeah.
like that, and premiums are going crazy.
Hmm.
So even something like this, when people, general public, look at it like, oh, that's nice to monitor or whatever, but it's like, well, what does that mean for me? Well, if you're in
Yeah.
California and you're listening, a technology like this could significantly reduce your insurance premiums,
Yeah,
and keep you a lot
or
safer.
even flip the script. If you have people that are, it's sort of similar to the telecom communications play, right? There's a lot of places where they either don't have broadband access or they only have one provider, and that really
Yeah.
stinks. They have kind of like this monopoly. The same thing is happening with insurance in California.
Yep.
It's you might only have one provider, or you're just stuck. If your house burns down, there's nobody willing to cover it.
Yeah.
That's a huge binary flip. We're
Right.
not just talking about like, oh, we're competing with different services. This is
Mhm.
literally, if it's in place, you have a service. If it's not, you're screwed.
Hmm. Yeah, it's so true. I'm
Hmm.
in a more of a newer community in development, and it's like that. We have like one insurance provider now and like two broadband providers. That's
Right.
only recent. Like you're just stuck. You
Yeah.
either like it or you don't.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. And it's no secret why Comcast is voted like the worst company, because they
huh.
know that they're the only game in town for a lot of these, broadband issues. So it's like, and I think now the insurance companies are kind of adopting a similar thing. It's like, doesn't make sense for us to be here because the risks is just too high. So
Exactly.
yeah, being able to provide kind of that aerial intelligence and kind of that advanced warning, and be able to help coordinate once it happens. I mean, these are just really societal benefits that we're excited about being able to
Yeah,
offer.
for sure. Um, so we touched on already what sets you guys apart, how this is different to traditional UAVs and everything like that, which is, I mean, it's really eye-opening and kind of mind-boggling how you got to this point, but it's great, which is why I love having these kinds of conversations. Um, so your technology, and you mentioned already like how you kind of see it impacting and helping shape AI and robotics in general, because especially from a connectivity standpoint, it's
Mhm.
crucial for AI. And as we get to these next stages with like Apple's new updates on their new phones, they're talking about AI on device and stuff like that. But obviously, connectivity is so crucial.
Mhm.
We spoke about offline, being connected to data centers and stuff like that. Can you talk
Yep.
more about how that can help?
Yeah, absolutely. The analogy that I like to make is good AI really needs big data. I mean, if you think about, you hear about all of the kind of the deficiencies of like needing big sets, image sets to train, language models or image models, like whatever you're talking about. It seems like the more reliable, more consistent AI output only happens if you have that big data to start with. And the way that I like to look at it is whether we're talking about autonomous vehicles or a cell phone in your pocket or mobile applications or Internet of Things, it doesn't make sense to have all of those big data sets reside on every single one of those devices. It's just not practical. It's almost
Right.
it's like limiting in the capability. And so if we're going to really ask AI to live on these devices with limited sets, I see that as kind of like almost dare I say, dangerous or irresponsible. It's almost like letting an 8-year-old drive a car. I'm not sure you have the information you need to do the job right.
Yeah.
Right. So the way I look at it is in terms of yes, I love the possibility of what AI can do, but I think in order to do it well, in order and to have trust in it, that's the big thing. A lot of people are just, can I trust this? Well, the more data sets that you have, the more data points that you can work with, then I think that inherently will add to the trust. So then the question is, well, how do we let this more trustworthy AI, get in contact with these mobile applications? And really the answer is we just need to have better connectivity. I mean, right now we barely have enough connectivity to service our cell phones. I mean, and then we have barely enough connectivity where your Starlink is saying, hey, there's an entire market for broadband internet in rural areas.
Yeah.
I think having a persistent flight capability is really going to solve and fill that crucial gap. And here's why, just to put it in perspective. So we talked about how there were some other applications that were looking for solar powered persistent flight. And it's just solar power is really hard. Batteries don't hold a lot of energy. Solar doesn't collect it. And of the like dozen or dozen and a half groups that were really ramping up about a decade ago, fast forward today, and there's really only one or two that are kind of still in the game because it's such a hard problem to solve. In that vacuum, we've seen Starlink kind of saying, okay, well, this problem still needs to be solved. And we're not really doing it with solar, so we'll do it with satellites. Okay, so where does that get us? Most low Earth orbit satellites are about 500 or 600 miles. Starlink wants to push the envelope with 360 miles. That reduces the signal latency, but it also gets them a little bit close to the atmosphere.
Yeah.
One of their latest launches, they actually lost 80% of their satellites just because a solar flare knocked it a little bit off course, and it started skimming against the atmosphere, and boom, they just burned up. So, sorry for that $100 million mistake, and sorry, now we have all this extra LEO garbage floating around the atmosphere, right? And again, we talked about like needing an entire like aerial. You have to cover the entire planet all at once. You can't just position them. Solar powered aircraft, we're at 12 miles. Okay, 12 miles versus 360. We're literally 30 times closer than Starlink. And so what does this do is Starlink right now, because it's a satellite, you still need a dish. Okay, so that dish needs to be physically mounted on a building. So in terms of the capability, they're really only servicing broadband in rural areas because you can get Wi-Fi for a building, and that's about it.
Right.
But when we're talking about a solar-powered aircraft with a payload that's 12 miles up, we're really talking about cell phone towers that are just straight up overhead. So now when we can actually connect with 5G and LTE, we're not just talking about local Wi-Fi. We're actually talking Internet of Things, autonomous vehicles. We're talking about being able to let AI from the server farm reach out in real time and touch these mobile applications. So yeah, in terms of, we fully recognize that the vehicle itself is using deterministic control laws. It's not using AI to figure out how to like control each wing. But I still see this vehicle as a huge enabling technology for AI in general.
Definitely. Yeah. And I'm just curious here from my own perspective, because I've got clients in this space and conversations that I have in certain industries, especially like oil and gas and restaurants and things like that, is about edge compute, right? And for that benefit, we don't have the connectivity, we might be rural, we need something that's a little quicker. And I think cost is obviously a big driving force there as well, especially something like the restaurant industry. How does this work better, or what's the use case for this over like edge compute?
I think it is an enabling technology for edge compute. So right now, the way I like to say it is a solar powered aircraft, provides better capabilities than satellites, but for the cost and logistics of a drone. So if you think about any sort of the edge compute cases that they're looking on terrestrial satellites, we'd be able to provide similar services, but 30 times faster signal latency and about a 10x reduction in your operational expenses.
Amazing. That's great. And let's touch on, I know we already have a little bit, but I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into the role that Devorto's product and Tern itself is addressing in like global challenges, environmental issues, healthcare, things like that, because it can be used across the board here, right?
Yes. Yeah, I like to say that it's not the aircraft that matters, but it's really just trying to revolutionize how we collect and transmit data. I would say that's more of Devorto's mission, is we're a data company and we just have an aerial platform that's going to let us do new things with where we put sensors, how long they can live there, and how we're going to transmit and connect the data back and forth. So yeah, in terms of things like telehealth and being able to connect people that don't really have, say, broadband or even a lot of like reliable mobile connectivity, being able to bring that in is a huge value proposition for us. The other one that I really like is I understand the investors and the VCs, they're going to want to see the big market, but my background from NASA, I just love some of the good science that we'd be able to offer as well. Right now, we don't really have anything that persists in the stratosphere. So when it comes to collecting real-time data for both weather forecasting, or just obtaining the data we need to make more intelligent decisions about climate change, that's awesome for me.
Yeah.
We recently met with another company that's using AI for advanced earthquake predictions. And basically, I was kind of like, I just wanted to geek out and nerd out about the technology. And he was describing about how the AI actually runs through the different algorithms. And there were basically, okay, satellites and terrestrial and then stratospheric. And he was lamenting that, man, but we don't really have enough in the stratosphere to really like, we have to interpolate.
Yeah.
We have weather balloons. They deploy from like, a dozen different sites across the United States, but the sensor goes up and the balloon pops and you get like 20 minutes of data and that's it. And it's only like 10 data points. Like there's not enough to really go on. And so when we were talking about, hey, what would happen for your AI kind of advanced earthquake prediction if we could get that data? And it was like jaw dropping. Oh my gosh, this is so amazing. Please do this. So yeah, I mean, as much as there's the commercial, the big market opportunity, I'm equally excited about the good science that this would be able to deliver.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, you can just imagine, right, the impact they will have across those scientific fields, and then that's usually where it starts, right? Defense or some of these skunk work projects, and then us general public will be lucky to get it in like 5-10 years time.
Yeah, it usually starts from the exactly. The DoD kind of has the budgets to be able to play around with the new technology, and then once it gets a little bit more established, then it kind of circles out to the civilian side.
Like,
but that's not necessarily a bad thing.
No.
In fact, some people do ask me, because we have done several grants through the Air Force, oh, do you think somebody would ever want to weaponize this? And I'm like, I don't think it makes sense. I don't think it really does. For the same reason that we were talking about getting people or cargo from point A to point B doesn't make sense for a persistent capability. That holds true for armament. It doesn't make sense to bring it up, shoot something, and bring it back down, right? We want to just get somewhere and stay there. And so the way I like to look at it is the military has this insatiable appetite for ISR, right? Intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, right? Get a camera and look at like the points of interest, people of interest, pattern of life, what are they doing? And the way I like to look at it is if our military has to, push the button, I would at least rather make sure that they have good intelligence.
Yeah,
and I think Tern can provide that with a persistent capability, at least to make sure that the decisions that are being made with good intel.
Yeah, it's not just someone's hunch.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's why I see that the observation side of it is huge, right? If you've got something consistently in space, always tracking it, so even if it's not a continuous feed, but you've got a regular feed of the same area or situation or border or land, whatever it is.
Well, the nice thing about being able to relocate and travel from point A to point B is that you can actually have an asset. You don't have to worry about when do we lose visual line of sight, is the window closing? I mean, you can just have a loiter. Just just pop it over where you need it.
There's 2 questions on that before we go to one of the last sections here. But one, how is it controlled? And then 2, you mentioned landing for like payload upgrades and stuff like that. But when do you need to land? Like, is there like a certain amount of hours before parts start to wear out, or days, months, years? And what does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay. So 2 questions. How's it controlled and how's it land? How deep into the woods do you want to go for the controls? I mean, that's my background, Maybe we should set aside like another hour.
Okay, yeah, maybe we should. All right, more specific.
I'll give the top level because that is a big elephant in the room. In fact, my background is actually electrical engineering for my dissertation, and one of the first things my faculty advisor asked was, "This isn't the aerospace department," and I said, look at this thing. We have 4 independent flying aircraft. They're all tethered together, trying to move a central payload which has no active controls. This is a controls problem. And really the first paradigm shift moved away from looking at it from kind of like what you call the inertial frame. Okay, you had to have kind of a shift in perspective. So imagine you're an ant sitting on the central hub, and now you're rotating with the system. And you're looking out into space, and you're looking at one of these tethered rotor arms. Okay, that view is going to be very, very boring for you. Because from that perspective, it's going to appear fixed in space, right?
Yeah.
With respect to your rotating frame. So one of the big control laws, the aha moments of the dissertation was don't try to micromanage everything from the inertial frame. Don't look at everything all at once. Just try to locally manipulate up, down, left, right, in, out of each rotor wing, each tethered arm with respect to that local rotating position. And then the central hub, its job is just to apply cyclic and collective commands, very much like a helicopter, to get vertical manipulation and from point A to point B. So that's kind of the top level of controls. For the landing and how often do things happen, I do like to say that yes, we persistent flight. We can stay up however long we need to, but it's not. We're not making energy out of nothing, right? It's not like. Okay, so then to follow up with the second question is, how long can this fly for? I do like to say that, yes, we collect enough energy, run on the batteries at night, and we can repeat that cycle indefinitely. But of course, things break down.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not going to be able to stay airborne like forever. We're not trying to overcome entropy. But the way that I do like to look at it is, and now it becomes more of a mean time between failures for the different components. So low power aircraft running on electric motors is fairly efficient. It seems like the limiting factor is still going to be the batteries. So if you look at some of the other attempts that are using different bleeding edge technology for batteries, maybe something like lithium sulfur, those only go through about 20 charge discharge cycles, right? So you charge it up, discharge it, that's a cycle. If you think about that as being like one day, it's no wonder that 2 or 3 years ago, these aircraft were limited to 20-day endurances, right?
Yeah.
Because the batteries were failing. The good news with Tern is that because we're so aerodynamically efficient, we're not actually modeling it based on these bleeding edge technologies. We're actually just using lithium ion and lithium polymer. Those are not just TRL, but those are actual commercial products, right? So we know that those have 500 to 1,000 charge discharge cycles. So what we're actually looking at is the battery will probably fail after about 1.5 years. Now, would we fly the aircraft for a full 1.5 years? Probably not. We'd probably just cycle it around and then, upload and upgrade and payload packages, make sure things are okay. But just the idea of knowing that something could persist for, that many months is really the game changer.
It's a long time.
Yeah.
It's a really long time.
Yep.
I'm surprised, actually. All right, before we wrap up, I want to get your perspective on the future. Obviously, this is a robotics and AI focused podcast. This is definitely enabling technology for that space in general. But let's group together the UAV industry, robotics, AI as well. What do you think? What's your vision for the future, like the next 5-10 years for these spaces?
Yeah, I would say just in general for UAVs and robotics and AI, I really just like the idea of not having disaggregated little systems all over the place. I really like the idea of things being connected together in a meaningful and intelligent way. Like right now, it seems like so many different things are being siloed because we have the databases are in this facility. Like the hospital can only access their data here. I really think that the benefit that humanity is going to get from AI is going to be able to look at data across a lot of different spectrums. And then be able to interpolate and be able to make decisions based on that kind of entire sample set. And I just don't see that really happening with local devices or, hey, we have our data in a building. Like I really like the idea of big data in a server farm and then the connectivity being able to reach out to the mobile applications. Just for me personally, having the larger data sets leading to more reliable and consistent and trustworthy AI. I mean, I think that's a lot of the pushback right now is how do we know that the AI is good? And you even look at some of the like ChatGPT, like giving wrong answers,
Yeah.
So I really think that if we're going to have confidence and trust in AI, it's going to start with the data that we feed into it. Like right now, we're kind of having a garbage in, garbage out type of situation. The only way that we're really going to get that level of trust is to run it through just larger data sets and just look at it over and over again. If you can connect more things to it and then kind of monitor the output, versus just, hey, we're giving you a little fragment. Okay, well, the output is going to be based solely on that fragment. But if we can give you the whole picture, now you might actually be able to do something meaningful.
For sure. That's great. Yeah, it makes so much sense. It's going to be an interesting next 5 years. If you think back the last two, before the general public was even concerned with AI, and now people are complaining about it, like you say, giving wrong answers and stuff like that. You can just imagine what's going to happen in the next 2 to 5 years.
Yeah, it is moving really quickly. So we'll kind of see what happens in terms of what sort of legislation comes in, or kind of oversight, that sort of thing. But no, just from like a top level philosophical kind of my researcher kind of hat is just looking at like it. I'm a controls engineer, so everything's a black box, right? There's an input and an output. Right now, I don't think we have enough inputs.
Right.
So the output is terrible.
I think like Europe, from my reading anyway, Europe are kind of leading the charge on regulatory guidelines and things like that for AI, and kind of
and I'm not opposed to that, at least early on, because once the genie's out of the bottle, then it's really kind of like that's it.
Yeah.
I can draw a similar analogy to the FAA, which has historically been noted as like one of the slowest government agencies known to mankind. And okay, they earned that reputation. But we also have a gold standard when it comes to aviation. I mean, literally gold standard. When drones started coming out, it was really the DIYers, the people that are building it in their garages. And all of a sudden the FAA is like, oh my gosh, we have these things flying around everywhere.
Yeah.
So yes, they moved very quickly to regulate it. But I will say, I think that was for the best, because if you had a bunch of these like, weekend warrior hacks doing things wrong and then crashing drones into preschools, or like, it falls into a highway and causes like a 12-car pileup, that's going to ruin the entire industry, right? It only takes one bad apple to set that kind of negative public opinion. So I think the FAA coming in and regulating early was good. But then they were fast in terms of saying, this is what we see as safe. We're going to roll out that. This is our next incremental. And then they grew it relatively quickly. I think if some of the agencies that are regulating AI can kind of adopt that sort of, we're going to regulate it pretty fast, pretty early, but then we're going to iterate fairly fast. I think that could be a good model to follow.
Yeah, I need to stay on it. Yeah, you could see the benefits of that for sure. Should have happened with crypto as well, but that's a whole other episode. Okay, Justin, last 2 things before we wrap up, and apologies to any listeners or viewers if you're watching this on YouTube, but if you do notice an audio or visual change, it's because we had an uploading issue at the end of our last episode, so these last 2 questions got cut off. But Justin, where can people find out more about you and Devorto and follow your progress?
Yeah, absolutely. So LinkedIn is always a great resource. You can just look myself up, Justin Selfridge. Devorto, we also have a company page, so LinkedIn/company/Devorto. And then the website itself is devorto.io.
Awesome. And are there any exciting developments or projects that people can keep a lookout for on all of those pages?
Yeah, absolutely. So right now we're approaching our next critical milestone, which is we've done a flight, an unconstrained flight demonstrator indoors. And now that we've really dialed in the control gains, we're just making a few tweaks to the tail and bringing that outside for our really, truly first outdoor flight demonstrator. So that's a big one.
That's exciting. All right. Well, thanks again for taking the time twice now to record.
It is second time, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I look forward to keeping in touch and seeing all your progress.
Excellent. Yeah, I really appreciate you having me on the show.
Yeah, you're welcome. Take care.
Excellent. Thanks. Bye.